Everybody, welcome to the Daily Objective. And today is everybody's favorite day of the week, Philosophy Friday. We're going to be talking about a man who some have said all of philosophy are just merely footnotes to his work. I'm talking about Plato. We've got with us a
Plato said that all of philosophy is a footnote to his own works.
No. Some have said. I think I said. Anyway, I'm still very confused. My sleep patterns have still been a little bit odd, so I apologize in advance. But we're going to kill it here today. Everybody, please leave a like, hit the join button to support the channel and unlock cool features. And if you're watching this after we're live, you can hit the super thanks button and show your support. All right, now let's meet the guy whose voice you just heard. It's Jason Rheins.
Hey, how are you?
Decent. Okay, so I understand. Go ahead.
So, it's typical of me that at the beginning of these, I say, now I want to point out that this is not my area of expertise. Today, we're talking about Plato, and I'm very happy to say this is my area of greatest expertise. So
Plato specifically.
Ancient Greek philosophy, but I've worked particularly closely on Plato in the last 15 years.
Cool. Okay. Because I remember when we talked about Kant, you said I'm a few years behind on the latest in Kant scholarship. Whereas with Plato, it sounds like you are up to date, or you've been very busy studying Plato, even in the last 10 years, 15 years. So yeah. Wonderful. Okay. So in my understanding, there's sort of like two eras of Plato, like the earlier one and the later one. The earlier one, and obviously you'll correct me if this is completely off base. The earlier era of Plato, he's largely invoking his teacher Socrates, and like in his dialogues, he's like quoting Socrates. So basically, a lot of what people might think of like Plato's philosophy, the cave, the world of forms, all of that, he's really saying this is what Socrates said before his death. And then later Plato is when he's much older, he's influenced by Pythagoras, the numbers philosopher. And at this point, Plato turns his world of forms into sort of a number, like kind of like I think of it like almost like the Matrix with all the numbers everywhere, where like every perfect form has a numeric value. So now like math and philosophy, or math and Platonic philosophy, are sort of blended. That's kind of how I think of it. And you say?
A couple of things. So there's some basic truth in that picture, but the details are a little more complicated. So there are several variables that we can kind of look at when we talk about Plato's development and his style of writing. So first of all, there's just his writing style. And his writing style in particular is what we use to relatively date the dialogues. That is, there are very few cases where we have a specific date when a dialogue must have been. Occasionally, they seem to reference a historical event that gives us a certain terminus from which. So like, this couldn't have been written before this guy died, so it's written after. And so mostly the style in which they're written, the style of Greek, tells us something about which are the early dialogues, which are the late dialogues, and which are the ones sort of in between. People also use the developing philosophical views, or what they think are the developing philosophical views, to also date the dialogues. Now, that method is honestly parasitic off of the literary style, or what we call stylistics, or stylometrics. So they kind of take their start from what stylometry says, and then they apply additional theses, usually what the authors happen to think about Plato's evolving views about the forms and maybe the soul. And then they kind of use that to shift around a little bit where they put the dialogues. I don't find that reliable. I think that just presupposes that we know what the philosophical sequence had to be, or that we're getting all of our interpretations of the philosophy right in each dialogue. Okay, so style theses. You could also say that one thing that develops over time is the extent to which they are aporetic and the extent to which they are dogmatic. So aporia is a Greek word that means to be without resources, to be stuck, to have no way forward. And it's the word that is used in the dialogues when Socrates encounters someone who thinks they know something. They think they know what courage is. Socrates asks them some questions to elicit what their view is, because they've never even heard of a definition, much less formulated. Then Socrates asks some more questions, and it turns out their views are inconsistent. So then they try another view. And Socrates asks some more questions, and now their views are inconsistent again. And then eventually they're like, I don't know. I don't know what, I thought I knew what courage was. Yeah, you've numbed me, Socrates. You've paralyzed me. I don't know. So that's aporia. And many of the dialogues, which we think are the earliest dialogues, are highly aporetic. Socrates asks someone questions, shows they don't really know. They think they know. Socrates claims not to know it himself. We don't get a kind of resolution. Incidentally, these earliest dialogues, they're written in a style of Greek that is very colloquial, just really probably how we think, probably just everyday Greeks, pretty well educated, high class Greeks, often not always, just would have talked, right? It's very conversational. The language is relatively unaffected. At the other extreme, you have dialogues that don't feature Socrates as the main speaker at all. Socrates is either there and sort of listening approvingly to the main speaker, or in one case, the final dialogue, the laws, Socrates may not be there at all. There's three characters. Two of them are named, a Spartan and a Cretan. The other is an Athenian. He is unnamed. Since ancient times, some people have thought it was Socrates. Some people have thought it was Plato himself. Debate goes all the way back. So in these more dogmatic things, it seems like either the character of Socrates or one of these later philosophical protagonists is not just asking questions, but also putting forward his own views. Now, sometimes he will couch these in terms of, I'm not exactly certain about this, or I don't have all the details worked out, or we'll have to keep questioning this later on. But all in all, like, they seem to put forward positive views of how things are. And these are the views that, since Plato's time, people have said are Plato's own views. And there is sort of transition. There are dialogues that are sort of in between. So the Meno, for example, is a dialogue where you start to get some positive sort of views that seem to be Plato's own, like that the soul is reincarnated, and that learning is really recollection in the soul, but are also very unclear, like, what is virtue? I don't know, very aporetic. So, but by the Timaeus, a very late dialogue where Socrates is there, but almost all the speaking is by this guy Timaeus, this Pythagorean scientist. It's just, Plato's sort of views about how the whole natural world works. So all that is just, and the last thing I'll mention is, you mentioned that sort of the early dialogues has this more ethical bent, later stuff has this mathematical stuff. So this is an ancient view, that the way Plato developed was, first he studied from Socrates, learned ethics, then he got into Pythagoreanism and maybe also dialectic, learned natural philosophy from them, and maybe dialectic or from a third source, and then kind of got the kind of metaphysics you get in the Republic or in the Timaeus. So from what we can tell, Plato's metaphysics, including his sort of views about the mathematical structure of the sensible world, are not by any means from Socrates himself, though we know precious little about what Socrates himself said or did. So I think I've been talking long enough. So
and yet not long enough. So you say we know precious little about what Socrates said. Now, when Plato is basically quoting dialogues, discussions that Socrates was a part of.
He's not quoting it. He's right. Well, okay, go on.
Well, so are those actual conversations that took place, or is he saying, is it kind of like the Talmud where you're like, this rabbi would say this if he were talking to that rabbi 100 years later? Is that what he's using? Is that what he's invoking Socrates as for?
Yeah. So, right. So the dialogues are historical fiction, right? So like the Three Musketeers is set in Paris, like at the time of Louis the 14th. And there was a Louis the 14th with a certain queen, and there was that queen. I think it's it's Louis the 13th. Doesn't matter, right? Like, and Richelieu is a real guy, and he's in the books, right? But like Richelieu says stuff, and there's no reason to think Richelieu ever said that stuff. And the portrayal of Richelieu, like that might be right in some ways. It probably is not accurate in other ways. So for all we know, Socrates may have had conversations with some of the people he is conversing with in the dialogues. In fact, in dialogues like the Crito, where Socrates talks to one of his followers, Crito, right? Like, absolutely Socrates talked to Crito. It's probable even that some of his followers, maybe Crito himself, wondered why Socrates wasn't escaping the jail and was waiting to be executed when he easily could have gotten it. But the specific reason Socrates gives, the way he expresses himself, the dialogues sometimes frame this as, here's the conversation they had. Like sometimes they are framed stories. So two guys will be like, were you there when Socrates did this? Like, I wasn't there, but I heard it from this guy who had memorized the whole thing. And then he told me and I memorized it. And you're like, what do you mean you memorized it? Like, he heard it, you heard it from him, there's it wasn't written down. Anyway, so they are inventions of Plato, although the characters are not invented. A few of the characters may be, but many of them are not invented characters. They were real people. Probably Socrates is highly stylized and in some ways perhaps even idealized. We have different depictions of Socrates in other contemporary works. We have a comic depiction of him in Aristophanes' play The Clouds. But that may be no more of an accurate depiction of him than the depiction, like if there was a skit about Stephen Hawking on Saturday Night Live, like they wouldn't know it, they would just be like, generic stuff some genius guy says, but you don't understand, right? Mm-hmm. And then there are dialogues by another student of Socrates, Xenophon, who is a pro-Spartan Athenian general. And those Socrateses look very different from Plato's. And frankly, the Socrateses in Plato's early dialogues look quite different from a dialogue like the Republic or the Philebus written much later. And so it's arguable that there isn't even a single Socrates, even in all of Plato's works.
Okay. So let's talk about what is Plato's actual philosophy. Here's my understanding. Among other things, he poses a problem of universals, which to me, I think of it as interchangeably as like the problem of concepts. And I guess we can talk about the difference between those things. So again, my understanding, Plato says, there's all these logical problems, like with numbers, like if you add 2 to 2, but then you like divide it in half, you end up with like more individual numbers that you could sort of isolate mentally than you had to begin with. Little mind tricks like that basically kind of disprove mathematical perfection or logical perfection in a way, which sort of leads him to say there must be some kind of innate knowledge of things that allow us to be mathematic. Another kind of problem that he poses and solves, he says, I've never seen a beautiful. I can't point to, there's a beautiful over there. But when I see something beautiful, I know what beautiful means. So again, I must have some innate concepts. And that's where, concepts/universals come from. What do you make of what I just said?
Okay, couple of things.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't call, if you, by the problem of universals, you just mean how can we have knowledge of in a unitary form that applies equally well to many different particulars or something like that. And if you approach it metaphysically, it's the universals. If you approach it epistemologically, it's a problem of concepts or something like that. So Plato is, so far as I know, the first to really kind of grapple with that in a serious way. But I wouldn't call it the problem of universals. I don't even love that's not what Plato calls it, because universal is I mean, it's a Latin form of a term that Aristotle introduces. The word was in Greek, and Plato even uses it once in this interesting way that's like this, but katholu, which is sort of like taken as a whole. So blah, 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 taken as a whole, right? So like these taken as a whole, right? But Plato doesn't have a system, doesn't use it systematically. The closest he says is a problem of one over many. And he says there are a number of problems of one over many, like how are the many parts of a single object all one? But he says, the real interesting one is how are all these many things that we call by the same name one? And what is that name really a name of? Is it the name of those things? Plato's view is no, beauty is not the name of all the things that we call beautiful, really. Beauty, or I mean, it's applied to those, but properly speaking, beauty is a single object, an intelligible being that is not sensible, that can be grasped not with the senses, but with the intellect. So, and all beautiful things get that name from beauty itself, by some kind of relationship, which we sometimes call for short participation. Plato calls it different things. He sometimes calls it reflecting or resembling. He sometimes calls partaking of or participating in, having a share of. And for each of these are metaphors. And for each of these different metaphors, Plato himself points out certain drawbacks in a famous dialogue called the Parmenides. Like the problem of the third man is one case where, like, if you think of this as a resemblance relationship, that the many beautifuls are called that because they are similar to or imitations of, or they're like the beauty, then you get this problem of another kind of higher beauty. So now, what does that have to do with the mathematics stuff? Well, so it's two things. First, those mathematical kinds of puzzles, they interest Plato. He has the character of Socrates mention them in a famous passage in the Phaedo, called the Intellectual Biography, where Socrates is saying how he started using the theory of forms. And the way he describes it is he was trying to learn a little bit of natural philosophy, particularly the issue of how things come to be and pass away. So how change works, right? Like, how did this become beautiful? How will it cease to be beautiful? And he didn't like any of the theories. They didn't make sense. He had problems with Anaxagoras' theory not being teleological enough. Eventually, he just said, I'm just going to fall back on the forms for now. It's a booby prize. It's a runner-up. Like, it's a consolation gift. Eventually, someone will give me a teleological explanation of change. But until then, like, I'll just say it's beautiful because of beauty, and it's good because of goodness. But in any case, in the process of talking about the kinds of change that are confusing and trip him up, he talks about, like, how is it that when you bring one and one together, they are two, but two is more than one. So now one and one when they were separate were two things, and one when they are together are two, like, things like that. And now he thinks, Plato actually seems to say in, like, the Republic, that things like that, those kinds of puzzles that occur when you do not just math, but like theory of math kinds of things. Well, one, it's a confusing way to think about change, but more importantly, like, they do start to lead you up to higher reality. So for Plato in the Republic and thereafter, at least, mathematics is the ladder by which the mind ascends to ever more abstract and less sensible things, until ultimately you're contemplating intelligible beings, the really real things, the individual forms, and then the highest of all of those, the form of the good. So, and it seems that mathematics either concerns a level just below of reality, just below the forms, or as he also puts it, it's when you do certain things from the forms, but you do it sort of hypothetically. So like there's a bunch of math and it's true because there really is a double and there really is a triple and they're really real things. Now, mathematicians don't know that, only philosophers know that, but the sort of mathematicians sort of acting as if they did that do discover stuff. So either he thinks math is just that, or Aristotle says this about Plato. And there are dialogues where, late dialogues, the Philebus and the Timaeus in particular, where Plato seems to think, actually, here's the forms, here's sort of bodies and the sensible, and then like the structure that the sensible world has is because of mathematics. So like the reason that the elements of things relatively hold together, they're always changing, but it's not a total Heraclitean flux, is because they have these tiny little triangles in them that make platonic solids as sort of atoms that sort of build up. Really, it's the triangles that are the atoms, but that build up into larger things. And it's by certain musical harmonies that different strands of being and becoming are sort of united into our immortal souls. So now, and souls are here in the world of change. They're not visible. So that like they're in between bodies and forms because they're not visible, but they do change and move, which the forms don't. So, and mathematics sort of makes that stuff up. So maybe he ultimately thinks mathematical objects are in between them, but there's also a little bit of evidence here, almost entirely from Aristotle and later sources, that really late on, he starts associating some of the forms themselves with mathematical objects in some weird kind of Pythagorean way. And we just don't have a lot of reliable evidence. And what evidence we do have, even if it's legit, it's super hard to interpret because it's like this weird mathematical mysticism and it's unclear what the hell any of it means.
Okay, so it's not like I thought, which is like that the Timaeus is like one big explanation or like depiction of like the world being like the world of forms, like injected with number steroids, numberness.
No, I mean the Timaeus is by far the most, at least in the, so Pythagorean means different things. For most, prior to Plato, for most of the time that there had been Pythagoreanism, it was mostly a kind of cult that believed in reincarnation and believed in certain weird rituals, and that came from Pythagoras. There's no evidence that Pythagoras, contemporary or near contemporary evidence that Pythagoras did anything with math. Maybe just the fact that the tetractys, a little pyramid of 1 dot, 2 dots, 3 dots, 4 dots, might have been their symbol at the beginning, but that could be anything. Later, Pythagoreans, they believe in the reincarnation of the soul. So they believe you'll be reborn as different animals depending on your conduct and things like that. And later Pythagoreans, much closer in time to Plato, who Socrates or Plato may have studied with probably, did do important mathematics and had a kind of mathematics structures the world philosophy, Philolaus and Archytas in particular. And Plato does take stuff from them, and it seems like Timaeus is associated with southern Italy, which is where these guys are from. That's where the Pythagorean Greeks had their home base, sort of. And absolutely, the Timaeus talks about the Platonic solids as structuring the elements, talks about harmonies, musical harmonies, structuring the soul and giving it what constancy it has, which is not much. It has because of mathematics, but it doesn't specifically talk about the forms in math terms. It never says like the good is the one or being is the equal. It doesn't say that. It does say things like homogeneity or equality or equidistance is like in all ways better because it's more beautiful. So it kind of relates them, but it doesn't say beauty equals equality or something like that. So tons of mathematics with something of a Pythagorean pedigree flavor. But the mathematics isn't so much of a level of forms, it's sort of the next step down. And it's explaining more or less why nature, such as it is, has what order such as it has, which is a lot more than a Heraclitean flux, but nothing, nothing compared to the forms, but more compared to oblivion, or total chaos.
So to Plato, ideas or concepts, abstractions are better, like they're more pure than sensory data. So whereas to Rand, for all that's actually real is what you can perceive with your senses. That's all you really know to be true. You organize it mentally into concepts. To Plato, concepts are pure. They're what would you say? They're unmolested by the imperfection of existence. So the highest possible form of existence is to be a form, the form of good, and therefore basically our mind is more honorable and good than our body. And Plato thus concludes that indulging in pleasures of the flesh is disgraceful, and only the philosophers who abstain from such indulgences will be able to find honor and virtue and then go to heaven, which was then called Hades. Am I correct?
Yeah. So, Hades is just the afterlife / the underworld. Sometimes Plato says that compares the ascent of true philosophers to some better place, going to the Isles of the Blessed. So like sometimes Greeks think that like certain really great heroes, the gods want to favor, like get to go to some better place. And it's not clear if it's sort of in Hades or it's just a place out beyond the ocean or whatever. So he'll sometimes say that. And then in the Timaeus and in the Phaedrus, he says that they go back to their home star, that all of our stars, or all of our souls started out on a home star before being put in the different planets, and if you live, like 3 philosophical lives in a row or something, you get to hang out there for a few thousand years, but then, you return to the next. Okay. So there's absolutely a value-based measure when talking about the forms versus sensibles, or the many particulars. The forms being better in every way, this stuff being worse. He seems to reject the idea that there are forms of bad things. There's a form of the good. There isn't a form of the bad. And in what way are the forms better? Well, there are various sort of metaphysical properties you can point to. The most important ones are these. They are unitary, so there is only one thing, beauty itself. There are many beautiful things. And in fact, he has an argument for why there could only be one beauty, because it would kind of, if there were multiple ones, there would be one that stood over all of them, and that would be the one. They are unabrogated. They are pure in the sense that they are all what they are, in no way not. Beauty is in no way ugly. Goodness is in no way bad, neither in itself nor is the cause of anything bad. Equal is in no way unequal. And this is interesting because all throughout the sensible world, Plato thinks you never find that. Things are beautiful in one respect, but ugly in another, or beautiful to one person, but ugly to another. Or, and this is the most important thing, beauty for some time and ugly thereafter, or not beautiful, right? Before it existed, it wasn't beautiful. Once it loses its luster, or once it's destroyed, it's not beautiful. And above all, it seems that the fact that the forms are changeless, so that they are what they are, as they are, is the kind of highest metaphysical credential, or the most, I think that's what most draws him to it. That's sort of what comes out of the Parmenidean tradition, that like what's really real and also what's really knowable is what is changeless. So you might think there are sort of two, if you ask like, why does he think that that makes the forms so special? What, okay, granted, if there are forms, they would be like this. Why does that make them better, right? And I think the answer is sort of two things. Changelessness means one is always a changelessness of a certain kind, or eternity, is associated by the Greeks with the gods and the divine. The gods, the word immortal is synonymous with the Greeks for the gods, which is another way of saying the best thing there is. The best, Greeks don't want to die. If they do die, they want their name to be remembered. They want to achieve some kind of immortality. Even Plato thinks we're all striving after some kind of immortality. The forms have that. They are timeless. They are changeless. That's awesome. And then also, because they are changeless and also unabrogated, but more importantly, because they're changeless, we can actually have knowledge of them, because knowledge is this way and always that way and not that way. Whereas about the sensible world, which is constantly changing, we can at best have true opinion. So I have a true opinion about where my car is right now. It's in the driveway, right? Like, but if someone sneaks in and moves it, like it won't be true anymore. Hell, when I drive to work after our interview, it won't be true anymore. And my opinion will have gone from true to false if I still have that opinion. So that's, yeah, that, I mean, that's the value of the forms. And I think that's why Plato values them on the one hand and relatively disvalues the sensible world of change. Timaeus, one of Plato's late dialogues, and the one I've worked the most on, incidentally, is interesting insofar as it has, you might think it has a slightly more positive view about what Plato calls becoming, or coming to be, that which changes the sensible world. So now, to be clear, everything I'm about to say, I think, is all one consistent view. And you just get different shades of it, different flavors of it, call it Plato in different moods, or seen from this side, it looks this, seen from that side, it's like that. So from certain views, certain moods, Plato is more ascetic, more of an ascetic, more anti-body, more anti, this physical life, more pro the afterworld, and just and then more just, and tends to describe the world of becoming in more Heraclitean, it's just crazy chaos garbage terms. In later Plato in particular, where Plato seems to have a theory about how the sensible world has a relative kind of structure. It's nothing like the forms, but it's something. He seems to sometimes talk more positively about it. In particular, in the Timaeus, you get a sense of how the cosmos as a whole, which is a god, and the sun, which is a god, and the moon, which is a god or goddess, or like how they can be immortal, because Plato thinks they're gods, thinks if they're gods, they have to be immortal, but they're bodies. How can bodies last forever? Well, these have to be very special ones, and they have to be created by an eternal form god called the demiurge, and so on. So, so in different moods, different perspectives, you get more one side, more the other on how negative he goes about becoming. But generally speaking, pretty negative. And generally speaking, I mean, when philosophers have a choice about like, should I pursue power, wealth, whatever, or should I just keep thinking about the good? He thinks they absolutely want to just keep thinking about the good. This other stuff is shadows on a wall. It's worthless. Like you have to coax them to be like, please run the city for us. Please, like the city set you up. They taught you how to philosophize. Don't you want to pay it forward? Like, okay, all right, fine, I'll do it.
Yeah, I think you might have answered Enric's super chat here. He says, is there a singular god or force as in Aristotle's unmovable mover and having a relationship to forms?
Yeah, so Aristotle actually, in say Metaphysics Lambda, so Aristotle's theology develops, but the developmental picture is very contested because we don't have a reliable way of really relatively dating the different parts. And and people disagree about what's consistent and what isn't consistent. So like one way you tell, it doesn't matter. But even in Lambda, which I think most people agree is sort of his most refined version of his theology, metaphysics book Lambda, he says, he gives his argument for an unmoved mover. And of course he says, like, how many of the unmoved movers there are? And he says, well, that's really whatever Eudoxus or the other kind of astronomers tell us is the number of intermoving spheres we need to preserve the phenomena. Like, I guess that's what it'll be. And there'd be a whole bunch of these. But then he says, he quotes Homer, the rule of many is not good, let there be one king. And he seems to think there's one basic unmoved mover, and there are other movers who are moved by love of the unmoved mover. So Aristotle is, in this sense, you could say henotheistic, which is different from monotheism. So monotheism says there's only one God. And then the whole setup is like, you exclude other gods, you deny their divinity, you deny even their reality. No, just one. If you have to, you relegate. Those aren't gods, those are angels. Those aren't, whereas henotheism says there's one main God. Yeah, there are other gods too. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes they're aspects of the one main God. Sometimes they're, like his fingers or his helpers, but there's just no emphasis on only one. It's just, there's one main one that we're emphasizing. And Plato is like that too. For Plato, my super subspecialty is Plato's theology. So for Plato, there is sort of two things he talks about that sound the most like what you would call capital G God. Again, in a henotheistic, not monotheistic way, because he always thinks there are other gods and he talks about them. And that is the form of the good, as he presents it in the Republic, and the demiurge as he presents it in the Timaeus. Now, I happen to be one of those who think they're the same thing. The demiurge is just the kind of allegorical figure standing for the form of the good in the creation story in the Timaeus. Other people think they can't be the same thing, and if they think they're not the same thing, they have to think that the demiurge is somehow lower than the form of the good. Among gods who are in the world of change, the greatest one is the cosmos itself. So the body of the entire physical universe, which is a sphere, and its soul, often referred to the world soul or anima mundi in Latin, that is a god, and that's the biggest of the lesser gods. The demiurge creates the world soul and creates its body. He also creates lesser gods who are like others, like the earth and the planets and so on, and the stars. And they are the demiurge's children. They exist for all time because they exist in the spatio-temporal world. So from the start of time onward, whereas the demiurge is timeless. He's outside of time. So that seems to be a kind of two hierarchy view. There's gods at the level of timeless eternity, like the forms, including the demiurge. And Plato says the demiurge is the best, the most good of the intelligible and eternal beings. So the most good of the forms, which I presume is the form of the good. But there are arguments about that. And then there's the world soul, and then the other kind of gods of the cosmos here in our world. And outside of time, existing for all time. And then there's a question about where nous, or intellect, or mind, which is a term that Greek philosophers had been associating with a kind of philosopher's god for 200 years, 150 at least to 200 years, and which Aristotle also associates with the unmoved mover and God, nous. And in Plato interpretation, there's this question of where does nous fall, and is nous the demiurge, or is nous the world soul, or blah, blah, blah. And that's a big interpretive mess, but nous, Plato associates the gods with nous, intelligence, intellect. Incidentally, nous is Plato's sort of highest and best word for that part of the soul which grasps the forms. And it's the knowledge you have when you grasp the forms.
Okay. So would Plato say that even if when you're looking at your car in the garage, and if you say the car is in the garage, it's still kind of problematic because it's changing, because the fact that it's a car, that it's there is not entirely the same from millisecond to millisecond. And if it were to move hypothetically, then it wouldn't be there. So your statement is sort of contingent. I mean, maybe that's not Plato anymore, but how would you
there are places and times where there are times and moments in some of the dialogues, the Timaeus, the Theaetetus, some other places, where Plato says things like, we shouldn't even call this the fire over there. Like, the fire is a form, right? This is a temporary appearance of fire-like attributes that resemble the fire for now. And like if we were being really, really fastidious, we'd say something like, there appears, it appears fierily in this part of the spatial receptacle that appears now as garage. Like that's if we were being really, really fussy about it. And sometimes he talks like that's if we were being really precise. So yeah, but he would certainly say like, for now, at this moment, this way. Or he'll say, yeah, it's not right that the car is in the garage. This is not anything. It's not an is, it's a becomes. So like it becomes now. It's changing into. It's becoming car in garage. It's ceasing to be car in garage, as that will cease to be true. But only car itself is, assuming there are forms of artifacts, which it seems like Plato is on the fence about. We hear about a form of the bed in the 10th book of the Republic, but Aristotle tells us that at least later, there were active debates in the academy about whether or not they should posit the forms of artifacts.
Let's talk about Plato's influence on the world. It's my understanding that Christianity largely is sort of the sort of later development that is like maybe not exactly a child of Plato, but maybe a great grandchild, right? Like later Platonists would kind of fuse Platonism with maybe Judaism and maybe other influences, and Christianity would emerge. In general, would you say Plato?
I'd say like Plato is Christianity's great uncle, like your grandpa's brother. But like if that great uncle like decided which prep school you should go to, and you spent all your summers at his house, and he had a really big influence on you.
Okay, there's a metaphor. So that's the most jarring way that Plato influenced the world, of course, because Christianity definitely impacted the world and still is. Could you think of other ways that Plato's philosophy impacted the world?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
So the entire way that we do mathematics and think of mathematics in the West is heavily influenced by Plato and also Aristotle. So it seems like you were starting to get arguments by Plato's time about like mathematics that we would begin to call proofs. But I think that it's a certain view of knowledge that Plato has and a certain structure of logic that Aristotle has that make Greek mathematics have this distinctive flavor of being proof certainty kind of setup. So in other societies like the Babylonians, the Indians, you have Egyptians, you have extremely sophisticated mathematics. The Babylonians in some ways were way ahead of the Greeks at many different points in their history. But what you don't have in those mathematical systems, as ingenious and amazing as their methods of calculation and discoveries are, they don't have this thing where like, I will prove to you for an absolute certainty that this must be this way and can't be that way. I mean, there's a little bit, but like it tends to be more of like, you want to like, here's how you figure out this. Like, here's a way you can get like the roots of this polynomial. Like, here's a way to do that. So it's more like algorithms or methods, and less about prove that this method can never fail. And I think that this owes something, at least, to Plato as well as to Aristotle, at least for kind of being rigorous. And then how we think about math in terms of like its different subcategories really was framed by Plato. So in later antiquity and so on, there came to be this notion of the 7 liberal arts. The trivium, which is grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium. And the quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music or harmonic. That's straight out of Plato's Republic, book 7, where he divides up the mathematical sciences as those 4, or 5 if you count geometry twice, once for planar geometry and once for solid geometry. But typically he says, there's 4. In Greek ethics, and Western ethics, Plato already is changing things in a very dramatic way. It's not the kind of Jesus view of sort of justice and of turning the other cheek, but it is this interesting view of resoundingly rejecting the notion that justice is doing good for your friends and harm to your enemies. Plato is defending the idea that justice is justice never does harm to anybody. And Plato is responsible for a kind of notion in Greek ethics that dominates his theory and Aristotle's theory and the Stoic theory, the Stoic in a more extreme way. This may go back to Socrates, but the idea that in order to be happy, you need virtue. And to some extent, some of these things are in the Greek cultural idea already, but in other ways, Plato really makes it solid. So the idea that like a city should make its people virtuous, it's kind of a Greek idea already, but Plato takes it to the max. All kinds of things. Many of our most important metaphors for beauty come from myths and visual images invented or profoundly transformed by their adaptation in Plato. Even the idea of, you could say the idea of an afterlife as the resting place of souls who kind of wait there and then will return to the earth or something. Plato's not the only person in the ancient world who has that view, but probably has an enormous impact on those views. Because if you think about early Judaism, early Christianity, early Islam, their views about resurrection of the body, right? Your body gets up again at the day of judgment, right? It's not about where your soul goes. And Greeks, who had read Plato were like, this is stupid. Like, just, make a different body. Like, what do you need a celestial body? No, just don't make heaven like a place, and even some Christians, early Christians who had read Plato were thinking more along these lines. Plato changes the face of literature in an important way and adds to the kind of stock of characters. There are ways in which his character of Socrates is like Odysseus in certain respect, the kind of ironia, we call it irony, but it's sort of, for the Greeks, means something like insincerity, saying one thing meaning another. But in other ways, he's not like Odysseus, because Socrates is a moralist and lives for a kind of philosophical quest. And in fact, I would say, look, it was Socrates who, became a martyr for philosophy. And then, as the sage Confucius is to Confucianism, or as the sage Buddha is to Buddhism, so Socrates sort of became for Western philosophy subsequently. But I highly, highly doubt he would have become the central kind of martyr figure whose style of seeking the truth, holding back nothing, questioning everything, etc. I don't think that would have been the case without Plato. There were other students of Socrates spreading their own interpretations of what Socrates' message was, just like in early Christianity. There are a bunch of different people with very different ideas about who or what Jesus was and what it means and who should be converted and so on. And it's sort of impossible to tell what the historical person really thought, but you can see what different people are saying 50 years on, whatever. So the same is true of Socrates, only, Antisthenes, Aeschines, Xenophon, Plato, a bunch of others, Phaedo, were writing Socratic dialogues. Aristotle tells us it was a whole literary genre. So it's not like Socrates wasn't catching on in a certain big way, but Plato's depiction is so powerful and so beautiful and leaves such an indelible mark on anybody who reads it that I think like thereafter Socrates was just bound to be this kind of dominant symbol. And in fact, all of the Greek schools after Socrates, Greek philosophical schools, except the Epicureans, trace themselves back to Socrates. The Epicureans are hyper insistent. We have Epicurus made it up all himself, even though we know he took a ton of his ideas from Democritus. But the rest, they all say, we come from Socrates. So, I mean, those are just some of the ways. And then, of course, the questions which philosophy is even trying to answer are often the questions that Plato asked first, or first asked clearly.
The branches of philosophy themselves, metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, aesthetics. Is it true, or is it oversimplified to say that Plato basically breaks them into those branches?
I wouldn't say he breaks them into those branches, but it is true that he kind of approaches the central questions in each of these fields and treats them as an integrated system. So the metaphysics is related to the epistemology, is related to the ethics, is related to the theory of soul, is related to politics, is related to a theory of art and beauty. Like it's all part of a package, and each part answers certain very important questions. Like, yeah.
Interesting. So it's not so much that he breaks them into separate categories. It's that people are studying
doesn't.
them separately, and he's the one who integrates them in a way.
No, in the ancient world, and you really get this becomes clear in the time of Aristotle's first successor, Theophrastus. Also when the third head of the academy, Xenocrates, is in charge. At that time, you get what would remain the kind of standard division of philosophy for almost 2,000 years, which is logic, physics, ethics. And then sometimes people are like, maybe metaphysics / theology is its own thing. Maybe it's physics. And that's how it is. So like there's natural science, there's ethics, which is all the kind of humanities sort of things, would include politics, might include rhetoric, things like that. Logic is all of epistemology / logic. Some people even put rhetoric there. And then the natural sciences. So it's separate from math. And then again, like where you talk about God, where you talk about being, either that's in physics, because Epicureans and Stoics, they just think God is a body. So physics is just metaphysics for them. Or for Aristotle, it's its own thing. And that's tricky.
Okay.
So 3+1 is where it stays for a long time.
Christopher with the super chat asks, do they know the locations of the Academy and Lyceum?
Lyceum? Yeah.
Lyceum,
and in fact, the Lyceum, or what we think is the Lyceum, is, I believe, a more, apologize for rubbing my eyes, terrible allergies. We believe, I think we now have a basic idea of where the Lyceum was, as well as, the Grove of Academus. So yeah.
Well, there you go. Pretty straightforward. Well, let me ask you this. This is, the game of pull the concept out of the hat, the two concepts, and then tie them together, that I guess the Rand and her friends used to play. Could you tie Plato to the way that anti-abortionists define life? And
they have an other world. They're mystics. So Plato, I don't think would care at what point. Plato would have some view about when the immortal soul, the immortal part of the soul, the spark of reason, enters a developing sort of fetus. Even Aristotle this was for a long time known as the quickening, like in Highlander, because the belief was that like early on, you have organic growth, and that's not yet sort of human, even if it has human DNA, doesn't have that kind of soul thing. And then, you know, when it gets it, okay, then it's important, but it's not clear. But even if Plato thinks it has a soul, it's not even clear he thinks like you shouldn't euthanize it under certain cases. I think he probably thinks you should. And that's no big deal. The immortal part goes back to the heavens to be reborn again. You know, it's fine. No harm done. One way to put it is when you reflect on kind of Plato's view of the soul, it becomes, you realize how doubly mystical the view of that human life begins at conception is, right? Because even if you think you are human by virtue of some magic kind of moment, you don't know when that moment is. And other religions and mystics have other views about when that quickening happens. Hell, your Catholics had a different view up till the 19th century when the quickening happened. So that's one way to relate them. Another is just that
I was thinking of like conceptually how they conceptualize life, and maybe Plato's the way he elevates ideas above reality maybe had some relation.
So Plato thinks of life as a soul in a body. So when a soul is in a body, giving it its motions from within rather than from without, like a strong wind knocking you down, that's an animal, that's a life or a plant. And he thinks that what a soul is self-moving motion. It's motion that keeps itself sort of moving. And so I think for Plato, he would say the point at which there's self-generated motion sort of in this thing, you could call it alive. I don't think that means he would say you can call it human, but you know, you might, I suppose there's a kind of a partially Platonic argument that like a fetal heartbeat is like, that's like, but hell, like the second, there's chemical changes happening all the time. Are those self-generated motions? The chemicals are in the cells as they're dividing, like, oh, but a heartbeat counts and this doesn't. Like, it's all pretty arbitrary.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we are out of time. Thank you. I've never seen me this tired or like just kind of like dazed and confused on the show before, but we got to a lot. I'm glad you have so much to say that I barely had to speak at all.
Are there any super chats we missed?
No, we got some money from Marilyn and Jonathan, so thank you for that, but no questions that they sent. Oh yeah, anyone in Austin, Texas? I think Don Watkins is live in concert here tonight at Salem Center at University of Texas at 6, and that is not an ARC UK event. So if Don gets up there and says something, horrific, that is not on us. But jokes aside, coming up on ARC UK today at 8 p.m. UK time, James Valiant is joined by Robert and Amy Nasser, and they're going to discuss Leonard Peikoff's talk, Triumphs and Tribulations of a Talk Show Host. All right. Thank you, Jason. I believe next week we are planning a really cool episode, and hopefully I will not be asleep during that time. We're going to be talking about punk rock.
Fuck yeah.
Wow. And who says objectivists can't have fun? All right, everybody. Thanks, Jason. See you next week. And everybody, take care and goodbye.